The mountain man stood in the doorway of the small whitewashed church, his shadow stretching long across the wooden floorboards as the late afternoon sun blazed behind him. And there she was, a woman alone with a broom in her hands, sweeping dust and fallen leaves that had blown in through the open windows during yesterday's windstorm. Alpine, Texas, in the summer of 1876, was a harsh and unforgiving place, where the desert heat could bake a man's thoughts right out of his skull. And the mountains loomed in the distance, like ancient sentinels watching over the scattered settlements. Asher Owens had come down from those mountains after 3 months of trapping and hunting, his pack laden with furs and his beard grown thick and wild. He was a man built like the granite peaks he called home, with shoulders broad enough to carry a full-grown elk and arms corded with muscle from years of surviving in the wilderness. His dark hair fell past his collar, sun-streaked and tied back with a leather cord, and his eyes were the color of storm clouds rolling over the high country. He had not planned to stop at the church. He had been heading to the general store to trade his furs and stock up on supplies before returning to his cabin in the mountains. But something had drawn his attention, some movement in the corner of his vision, and when he turned his head, he saw her through the open door, sweeping with a steady rhythm that spoke of both determination and weariness. Meredith Garrett was 22 years old, though the last year had aged her in ways that did not show on her face but lived behind her eyes. She wore a simple dress of faded blue cotton, the hem dusty from her work, and her auburn hair was pinned up in a practical bun that allowed a few tendrils to escape and frame her face. She had not heard him approach, so intent was she on her task. And when she finally looked up and saw the massive figure blocking the doorway, she gasped and took a step backward, her hand flying to her throat. "I did not mean to startle you, miss," Asher said, his voice deep and rough from disuse. He had not spoken to another human being in weeks, and the words felt strange on his tongue. "I saw you working and thought you could use some help." Meredith pressed her hand against her racing heart and took a steadying breath. The man in the doorway was enormous, his buckskin clothing worn and stained from the trail, his presence filling the small church with an almost overwhelming energy. But his eyes, those gray eyes, held no threat. Instead, they looked at her with something like curiosity mixed with concern. "You gave me quite a fright," she said, her voice soft but steady. She had learned in the past year not to show fear, even when she felt it coursing through her veins. "But I suppose I should be grateful. This church is larger than it looks, and the dust seems to multiply faster than I can sweep it away." Asher stepped inside, ducking his head slightly to clear the doorframe, though the church ceiling was high enough to accommodate even his considerable height. He moved with the careful grace of a man accustomed to tracking prey through dense forest, each step deliberate and nearly silent despite his size. "If you have another broom, I would be happy to help. It does not seem right for you to be doing this alone." She studied him for a long moment, this stranger who had appeared out of nowhere offering assistance. In Alpine, strangers were common enough, as the town served as a waypoint for travelers heading deeper into West Texas or up into the mountains. But mountain men were a different breed entirely, men who chose solitude over society and the harsh beauty of the wilderness over the comforts of civilization. This one, though, seemed different somehow. There was a gentleness in the way he spoke that contrasted with his rugged appearance. "There is another broom in the back room," she said finally, gesturing toward a small door behind the pulpit. "But I must warn you, it has seen better days. The bristles are half gone, and the handle is cracked." "I have worked with worse," Asher replied, and the hint of a smile touched his lips. It transformed his face, softening the hard edges and making him seem less like a wild creature, and more like a man who simply happened to make his home in wild places. He found the broom where she had indicated, and true to her word, it was in poor condition. But Asher had spent years making do with whatever tools and resources he could find or fashion himself. And a worn broom was nothing compared to some of the challenges he had faced. He returned to the main room of the church and began sweeping the far side, working methodically toward where Meredith continued her own efforts. They worked in silence for several minutes. The soft whisper of the brooms against the wooden floor, the only sound besides the occasional call of a bird outside. Asher found himself watching her when he thought she was not looking, noting the way she moved with efficient grace, the way the fading sunlight caught the red highlights in her hair, the way her brow furrowed slightly in concentration. There was something about her that tugged at a part of him he had thought long dormant, a part that remembered what it was like to care about more than just surviving another winter. "You are new to Alpine," Meredith said, breaking the silence. It was not a question, but a statement. "I would remember seeing someone like you before." "I am not new to the area," Asher corrected gently. "I have a cabin up in the mountains, about 2 days' ride from here. But I do not come down to town often. Only when I need supplies or when the isolation starts to press too heavy on my mind." She nodded, understanding more than he might have expected. "The mountains must be beautiful. I have never been up that far. Since I came to Alpine last year, I have stayed mostly within the town limits. There has been too much work to do to allow for exploration." "You came here alone?" The question slipped out before Asher could stop it, and he immediately regretted the intrusion. But Meredith did not seem offended. Instead, her expression grew distant, as though she were looking at something far beyond the walls of the church. "I came here with my father," she said quietly. "He was the minister of this church. He had a calling to bring the word of God to this part of Texas, and I was all he had left after my mother passed years ago. So I came with him, helped him build this congregation from nothing. The people of Alpine were hungry for spiritual guidance, and my father gave them everything he had." The past tense did not escape Asher's notice. "Was?" he asked carefully. Meredith stopped sweeping and leaned on her broom, her gaze fixed on the simple wooden cross that hung on the wall behind the pulpit. "He died 3 months ago. A fever took him quickly, too quickly for the doctor to do anything more than make him comfortable in his final hours. He made me promise to keep the church running, to continue his work, so I do my best. I lead the services on Sundays. I tend to those who need comfort or guidance, and I keep this building clean and in good repair." Asher felt a weight settle in his chest, a mixture of admiration and concern. That is a heavy burden for one person to carry. Surely the town has offered to help. "Some have," Meredith admitted. "The women bring food sometimes, and a few of the men have made repairs when things break beyond my ability to fix them. But many believe a woman has no place standing behind a pulpit, speaking the words that should come from a man's mouth. They have been pushing for the church elders to send for a proper minister, a man who can take over my father's position. Until then, I do what I must." The bitterness in her voice was subtle, but unmistakable, and Asher understood it completely. He had seen enough of the world to know how people treated those who did not fit into their neat categories and expectations. In his own way, he had rejected those expectations by choosing to live apart from society, by making a life in the mountains where the only rules were those of nature. "Your father chose well when he asked you to continue his work," Asher said, resuming his sweeping. "A person's worth is not determined by whether they are male or female, but by the strength of their character and the depth of their commitment. From what I have seen in just these few minutes, you have both in abundance." Meredith turned to look at him, surprise evident on her face. She had grown accustomed to dismissal or condescension from the men of Alpine, even those who meant well. To hear such straightforward respect from a stranger, and a mountain man at that, left her momentarily speechless. "Thank you," she managed finally. "That means more than you might realize." They continued working together, and gradually the conversation began to flow more easily. Meredith asked about life in the mountains, and Asher found himself describing things he had never thought to put into words before. The way the sunrise painted the peaks in shades of gold and rose, the absolute silence of a snowfall in the high country, the satisfaction of providing for oneself through skill and hard work. In turn, Meredith told him about her childhood in Missouri, about the journey west with her father, about the small victories and large challenges of building a community of faith in a place where survival often took precedence over salvation. As the sun sank lower and the church filled with the warm golden light of late afternoon, Asher realized something profound had shifted inside him. For 3 years, he had been content with his solitary existence, had convinced himself that he needed nothing and no one beyond his own resources. But standing here in this simple church, sweeping the floor beside this remarkable woman, he felt the walls he had built around his heart beginning to crack. When the floor was finally clean, Meredith set her broom aside and surveyed their work with satisfaction. "It looks better than it has in weeks," she said. "Thank you for your help, Mr. Owens," he supplied. "Asher Owens." "And it was my pleasure, Miss Garrett." She tilted her head slightly, curious. "I did not tell you my last name." "No, but you mentioned your father was the minister. And I heard tell in town a while back about Reverend Garrett and his daughter coming to Alpine. I put the pieces together." Meredith smiled, a genuine expression that lit her face and made Asher's breath catch in his throat. "You are more observant than most, Mr. Owens. In the mountains, observation is the difference between life and death," he replied. "You learn to notice details." They stood there in the quiet church, the space between them charged with something neither could quite name. Asher knew he should leave, should collect his furs from where he had left them outside and head to the general store before it closed for the evening. But his feet seemed rooted to the spot, and his eyes could not quite leave her face. It was Meredith who finally broke the silence. "Will you be staying in town long, Mr. Owens?" "Asher," he said. "Please, just Asher. And I had planned to stay only a day or two, just long enough to trade my furs and get supplies. But I find myself thinking I might extend that stay a bit." "Oh." Her voice was carefully neutral, but he caught the flicker of interest in her eyes. He took a deep breath, knowing what he was about to say would either mark him as a fool or as the bravest man in Texas. "Miss Garrett, I am not a man given to speeches or fancy words. I spend most of my time alone, and I have grown accustomed to speaking plainly when I do speak at all. So I am going to say something now that might sound mad. But I ask that you hear me out before you decide I have lost my mind to the sun and the solitude." Meredith's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. "I am listening." Asher set his broom aside and turned to face her fully, his considerable frame casting a long shadow in the slanting light. "I am 30 years old, and I have lived in these mountains for 3 years. Before that, I was a soldier, fighting in a war that took most of my youth and all of my innocence. When the war ended, I could not settle back into ordinary life. Everything felt wrong, too loud, too crowded, too full of people who could not understand what I had seen and done. So I came here, to the mountains, and I made a life for myself away from all of that. He paused, gathering his thoughts, trying to find the right words for what he needed to say. For 3 years, I have been content with that life. I have not missed the company of others, have not felt the lack of anything beyond my own skills and resources. But standing here with you, helping you sweep this church, talking about things that matter and things that do not, I have realized something. I have realized that I have not been living. I have been hiding. Meredith's hand rose to her throat again, but this time it was not from fear. She could feel her pulse beating rapidly beneath her fingertips, could feel the weight of his gaze on her like a physical thing. Miss Garrett, Meredith, I know this will sound insane. I know we have only just met, that we have known each other for less than an hour. But in that hour, I have felt more alive, more connected to another human being than I have in the 3 years since I left civilization behind. And I cannot let this moment pass without asking you something that will either get me thrown out of this church or will change both of our lives forever. He took a step closer to her, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides, as though he were physically restraining himself from reaching for her. Marry me, Meredith. I know it is sudden. I know it goes against every rule of courtship and propriety, but I am asking you anyway. Marry me and let me show you the mountains. Let me build you a home where you can be yourself, where no one will question your right to speak or to lead or to be exactly who you are meant to be. Let me protect you and provide for you and spend my days learning everything there is to know about you. The silence that followed his words was absolute. Meredith stared at him, her mind reeling, trying to process what she had just heard. A proposal of marriage from a man she had met less than an hour ago, a mountain man who lived alone in the wilderness. It was absurd. It was impossible. It was everything rational thought told her to refuse immediately. But as she looked into his eyes, those gray storm cloud eyes that held such earnestness and vulnerability, she found herself hesitating. Because beneath the absurdity and impossibility of his proposal, she recognized something she had not expected to feel. Hope. Hope that perhaps she did not have to spend the rest of her life fighting to maintain her father's legacy in a town that did not truly want her leadership. Hope that perhaps there was another path available to her, one that led away from the expectations and limitations others tried to place on her. You are right, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. That does sound mad. Asher's shoulders sagged slightly, and he nodded. I understand. Forgive me for speaking so boldly. I will leave you to your evening and will not trouble you again. I did not say no, Meredith said quickly, before he could turn away. I said it sounds mad. But I have learned over the past year that sometimes the maddest choices are the ones that make the most sense in retrospect. May I ask you some questions before I give you my answer? Hope flared in Asher's chest, so intense it almost hurt. Ask me anything. Why me? Meredith asked. You said yourself we have only just met. What is it about me that has prompted such a dramatic proposal? Asher considered the question carefully, wanting to give her an honest answer. When I first saw you through that doorway, sweeping this church alone, I saw strength. Not the kind of strength that comes from muscle or force, but the kind that comes from enduring hardship and choosing to continue anyway. Then, when we spoke, when you told me about your father and your struggles to maintain this church, I saw courage and determination. And when you smiled, when you truly smiled, I saw a light that I did not know I had been missing from my life. He ran a hand through his long hair, a gesture of frustration with his own inability to articulate what he felt. I cannot explain it in any way that makes logical sense. I just know that in the moment I saw you, something in me recognized something in you. And I have learned, through hard experience, that those moments of recognition are rare and precious. To let one pass without acting on it would be a cowardice I cannot abide. Meredith absorbed his words, feeling their truth resonate somewhere deep in her chest. If I were to say yes, what would my life be like? You live in the mountains, far from town and from other people. Would I be expected to give up everything I know, everything I am? No, Asher said firmly. I would never ask you to give up who you are. If anything, I would hope to give you the freedom to become more fully yourself. As for what life would be like, I will not lie to you. It would be hard work. The mountains do not forgive weakness or carelessness. But my cabin is solid and warm. I have built it to withstand the worst weather. I am a skilled hunter and trapper, so we would never go hungry. And though we would be far from town, we would not be completely isolated. I come down for supplies regularly, and if you wish to maintain connections with the people of Alpine, we could arrange for that. What about the church? Meredith asked. My father made me promise to continue his work. Asher thought about this for a moment. Your father made you promise to continue his work, yes? But what was his work truly? Was it this building, these walls and floors and pews? Or was it the care and guidance he gave to people who needed it? Because if it was the latter, you could continue that work anywhere. The mountains have their own population, scattered as it is. Trappers, prospectors, families trying to make a go of it in the high country. They need spiritual guidance as much as anyone in town. But they rarely get it because no minister wants to make the journey up to see them. Hope flared brighter in Meredith's chest. She had not considered that possibility, had been so focused on maintaining her father's church in Alpine that she had not thought about taking his mission elsewhere. You truly believe I could continue that work in the mountains? I believe you could do anything you set your mind to, Asher replied. And I would support you in whatever way I could. Meredith took a deep breath, feeling as though she stood on the edge of a cliff, about to step off into open air with nothing but faith to catch her. Every rational part of her mind screamed that this was foolish, that she should send this man away and forget this conversation ever happened. But there was another part of her, a part that had been growing stronger over the past year of struggle and resistance, that whispered something different. That whispered that perhaps rationality was not the only guide worth following, that sometimes the heart knew truths the mind could not grasp. I have one more question, she said, and I need you to answer honestly, no matter how it might sound. I promise, Asher said solemnly. Do you believe in love at first sight? He did not hesitate. I did not before today. But standing here with you, feeling what I feel, I do not know what else to call it. Whether it is love, or the beginning of love, or simply recognition of a deep compatibility, I cannot say. But I know it is real, and I know it is worth pursuing. Meredith closed her eyes, seeking guidance from whatever force had brought this man to the church door at exactly this moment. She thought of her father, of the promise she had made to him, of the years she had spent trying to honor that promise against steadily mounting opposition. She thought of the future that lay ahead if she stayed in Alpine, a future of constant battle to justify her right to lead, of waiting for the church elders to send a man to replace her. And then she thought of the alternative, of mountains and freedom, and a man who looked at her as though she were something precious and rare. When she opened her eyes, She found Asher watching her with an intensity that should have been frightening, but was instead oddly comforting. "If I say yes," she said slowly, "I need time. Not years, not even months, but some time to arrange things here, to make sure the church and the congregation are taken care of, to gather my belongings and prepare for such a drastic change in my life. Can you give me that time?" "How much time do you need?" Asher asked. 2 weeks, Meredith said. "Give me 2 weeks to settle my affairs here, and then I will go with you to the mountains as your wife." The smile that spread across Asher's face was like the sun breaking through storm clouds, transforming him from imposing to radiant. 2 weeks, he agreed. "I will stay in town, find work to occupy myself, and help you with whatever you need to prepare. And at the end of those 2 weeks, we will stand in this church before whatever congregation you have built, and we will make our vows to each other." Meredith felt a laugh bubble up from her chest, part disbelief and part pure joy. "I cannot believe I am agreeing to this. Everyone will think I have lost my mind." "Let them think what they will," Asher said. "All that matters is what we know to be true." He reached out then, slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away, and took her hand in his. His palm was rough with calluses, his fingers strong and work-hardened, but his touch was gentle as he raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Thank you for taking this leap of faith with me." Meredith felt heat rise to her cheeks, felt her heart hammering against her ribs. She had been proposed to before, by a few men in Alpine who thought a minister's daughter would make a suitable wife. But none of those proposals had made her feel even a fraction of what she felt now. This was reckless and impulsive, and went against everything she had been taught about proper courtship. But it also felt more right than anything else in her life. "We should discuss the practical matters," she said, trying to regain some sense of rationality even as her hand remained in his. "Where will you stay for the next 2 weeks? And how will we explain this to the town without causing a scandal that makes the next 2 weeks unbearable?" Asher released her hand reluctantly and stepped back, giving her space to breathe and think. "I can stay at the boarding house. As for explaining it, we could tell people that we have known each other for longer than we have, that I have been courting you during my visits to town over the past year. It would not be the truth, but it would be close enough to keep the gossips at bay." Meredith shook her head. "No, I will not start our marriage with lies, even small ones told for convenience. We will tell the truth, that we met today, that you helped me sweep the church, and that we have decided to marry after 2 weeks of courtship. If people have a problem with that, they are welcome to voice their concerns, but they will not change our plans." The fierce determination in her voice made Asher's respect for her deepen even further. "As you wish," he said, "though I suspect we will face considerable resistance." "I have been facing resistance since my father died," Meredith replied. "I am quite accustomed to it by now." They made arrangements to meet the following morning, and then Asher collected his pack of furs from outside the church and headed toward the general store before it closed. Meredith watched him go, his broad shoulders and confident stride making him easy to follow with her eyes, even as the gathering dusk began to soften the harsh lines of the desert landscape. When he finally disappeared around a corner, she turned back to the church and allowed herself a moment of pure, uncensored reaction to what had just transpired. She had agreed to marry a mountain man she had known for less than an hour. She had agreed to leave the town and the church she had been fighting to maintain. She had agreed to a life in the wilderness, far from everything familiar and safe. And instead of terror or regret, what she felt most strongly was relief, as though some tremendous weight had been lifted from her shoulders, as though she had finally been given permission to stop fighting a battle she was never going to win. That night, Meredith lay awake in the small room adjacent to the church that had served as her home since arriving in Alpine. She thought about everything that had happened, replaying the conversation in her mind, examining it from every angle for signs that she was making a terrible mistake. But no matter how she looked at it, no matter what arguments she raised against the decision, she kept coming back to the same feeling. This was right. Asher Owens was right. The path ahead might be uncertain and difficult, but it was her path, chosen freely rather than inherited or imposed upon her by others' expectations. The next morning, Meredith woke early and dressed with care in her best dress, a deep green cotton with ivory buttons that her father had bought for her last Christmas. She pinned her hair up carefully and took a moment to study her reflection in the small mirror above her washstand. She looked the same as always, but she felt fundamentally changed, as though agreeing to Asher's proposal had unlocked some new version of herself that had been waiting to emerge. She found him waiting outside the church just after sunrise, freshly shaved and wearing clean clothes he must have purchased or borrowed. His hair was still long, tied back as it had been yesterday, and his eyes held the same earnest intensity, but there was also something new in his expression, a lightness that had not been there before, as though their agreement had lifted a weight from him as well. "Good morning," he said, and the warmth in his voice sent a pleasant shiver down Meredith's spine. "Good morning," she replied. "I thought we should begin by telling Mrs. Patterson, the woman who organizes most of the church activities. If we can get her support, or at least her understanding, it will make the next 2 weeks considerably easier." Asher nodded and fell into step beside her as they walked through the quiet streets of Alpine. The town was just beginning to wake, with shopkeepers opening their doors and the smell of cooking fires drifting on the morning air. Mrs. Patterson lived in a neat house on the edge of town, and when she answered Meredith's knock, her expression shifted rapidly from surprise to curiosity to concern, as she took in the sight of the mountain man standing beside her minister's daughter. "Meredith, dear, is everything all right?" Mrs. Patterson asked, ushering them inside. "Everything is fine," Meredith assured her. "In fact, everything is wonderful. Mrs. Patterson, I would like you to meet Asher Owens. Asher, this is Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, one of the pillars of our congregation." They exchanged pleasantries, and Meredith could see Mrs. Patterson assessing Asher with the practiced eye of a woman who had spent decades evaluating the character of others. Whatever she saw must have passed her standards, because her posture relaxed slightly, though her curiosity remained evident. "We have some news to share with you," Meredith said once they were all seated in Mrs. Patterson's parlor. "Asher has asked me to marry him, and I have accepted. Patterson's teacup froze halfway to her lips. "I see," she said carefully. "And when did this proposal occur?" "Yesterday evening," Meredith replied. "He came to the church and helped me sweep, and then he asked me to marry him right there in the sanctuary." The older woman set her teacup down with a decisive click. "Yesterday evening. Meredith, dear, do you not think this is somewhat precipitous? You have only just met this man." "I understand your concern," Meredith said. "Truly, I do. If someone had told me a week ago that I would agree to marry a man I had known for less than an hour, I would have thought they were mad. But when you know, you know. My father used to say that about his calling to ministry, that sometimes you just know a truth in your bones that cannot be explained or rationalized. That is what this feels like. Mrs. Patterson turned her attention to Asher. "And what do you have to say for yourself, young man? What are your intentions toward Meredith? What kind of life can you provide for her?" Asher met her gaze steadily. "My intentions are honorable, madam. I want to marry Meredith, to build a life with her, to protect and provide for her to the best of my ability. As for what kind of life I can offer, it will not be an easy one. I live in the mountains, in a cabin I built myself. It is remote and the work is hard, but it is also honest and good work. I will never make Meredith rich in terms of money, but I can promise her security, stability, and the freedom to be herself without judgment or restriction." The silence that followed was heavy with assessment, and Meredith found herself holding her breath, waiting for Mrs. Patterson's verdict. The older woman's opinion mattered, not because it would change Meredith's decision, but because it would set the tone for how the rest of the congregation received the news. Finally, Mrs. Patterson nodded slowly. "I will not pretend to understand this, or to think it is a wise choice by conventional standards. But I have watched you struggle this past year, Meredith, fighting to maintain your father's church against people who should have supported you, but instead undermined you at every turn. If this man offers you a chance at happiness and peace, then who am I to stand in the way of that?" Relief flooded through Meredith, so intense it brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "Your support means everything to me." "When is the wedding to take place?" Mrs. Patterson asked. 2 weeks from today," Meredith said. "That will give me time to arrange for someone to take over the church duties and to prepare for the move to the mountains." Mrs. Patterson stood and moved to a small desk in the corner of the room, where she pulled out paper and a pencil. "Very well. 2 weeks is not much time, but it is enough if we are organized about it. We will need to arrange the ceremony itself, of course, and prepare a wedding meal. And we will need to help you pack your belongings and determine what you will need for your new life." As Mrs. Patterson began making lists and plans, Meredith caught Asher's eye and saw her own gratitude reflected there. This was happening. This leap of faith was becoming real, and with Mrs. Patterson's support, it would be real in a way the town could not dismiss or ignore. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity and emotion. Word of the engagement spread through Alpine like wildfire, and reactions ranged from bemused support to outright disapproval. Some of the women in the congregation, particularly those who had worked closely with Meredith over the past year, were happy for her, seeing the marriage as an escape from an increasingly untenable situation. Others, especially some of the men on the church council, were scandalized by the speed of the courtship and tried to convince Meredith to reconsider. Through it all, Asher remained a steady, reassuring presence. He took work at the livery stable, earning money to contribute to their household fund and demonstrating his work ethic to the townspeople. He spent his evenings with Meredith, sometimes helping her sort through her belongings and decide what to take to the mountains, sometimes simply sitting with her on the church steps and talking about everything and nothing. With each passing day, Meredith's certainty about her decision grew stronger, and her affection for this quiet, strong man deepened into something that felt very much like love. Asher, for his part, found himself constantly amazed by the woman he was about to marry. Her intelligence, her compassion, her fierce determination to do what was right even when it was difficult. All of these qualities drew him to her more powerfully than physical attraction alone ever could. He learned that she loved to read, that her favorite time of day was early morning when the world was still quiet, that she had a gift for finding the exact words people needed to hear when they were struggling. And as he learned these things, he found himself imagining their life together, picturing her in his cabin, seeing her face across the breakfast table every morning for the rest of his life. The wedding was set for a Sunday afternoon after the regular morning service. Meredith had arranged for a traveling minister who passed through Alpine periodically to officiate, knowing that having an official church representative perform the ceremony would lend it legitimacy in the eyes of those who still doubted. She'd also arranged for a local couple, the Hendersons, to take over the church duties once she left. Mr. Henderson had some training in ministry and had been looking for a congregation to serve. And while Meredith knew he would run things differently than she had, she trusted that the church would be in good hands. On the morning of the wedding, Meredith woke in her small room for the last time. She had packed most of her belongings into 2 trunks that Asher had purchased for her, keeping out only her wedding dress and the few items she would need for the ceremony. The dress was her mother's, carefully preserved and altered to fit Meredith's slender frame. It was made of ivory silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, and wearing it made her feel connected to both her parents in a way that brought both tears and comfort. Mrs. Patterson arrived to help her dress and arrange her hair, pinning it up in an elegant style that left a few curls framing Meredith's face. "You look beautiful, dear," the older woman said, her own eyes suspiciously bright. "Your father would be so proud of you." "I hope so," Meredith replied softly. "I hope he would understand that I am not abandoning his dream, just taking it in a different direction." "Of course he would understand," Mrs. Patterson said firmly. "Your father loved you more than anything, and all he ever wanted was for you to be happy and to live according to your conscience. You are doing both of those things." The church was full when Meredith arrived, not because everyone approved of the wedding, but because everyone was curious. She could see it in their faces as she walked down the aisle, the mixture of genuine goodwill and barely concealed judgment. But then her eyes found Asher standing at the front of the church, and everything else faded away. He looked magnificent. Someone, probably Mrs. Patterson, had convinced him to get a proper haircut, though it was still longer than fashion dictated, just brushing his shoulders. He wore a new suit, dark wool that stretched across his broad shoulders and emphasized his powerful build. But it was his face that captured Meredith's attention, the way he looked at her as though she were the only person in the world, the way his eyes shone with an emotion so intense it took her breath away. The ceremony itself was simple and traditional. They exchanged vows, promising to love and honor each other for the rest of their lives. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife and told Asher he could kiss his bride, the kiss was gentle and reverent, a promise of things to come rather than a passionate declaration. But in that brief touch of lips, Meredith felt the truth of what they were building together, felt the foundation of love and respect that would carry them through whatever challenges lay ahead. The wedding meal was held in the church hall, with food contributed by various members of the congregation. There was roasted chicken and cornbread, fresh vegetables from the local gardens, and pies made by the best bakers in town. People congratulated them, some warmly and others with obvious reservation. But Meredith found she did not care about the doubters. She was married to Asher Owens, and in 2 days they would begin their journey to the mountains and the life they would build together. That night, Meredith stayed in a room at the boarding house, the same building where Asher had been lodging, but in separate quarters to maintain propriety until they left town. It felt strange to be married, but not yet truly beginning their life together. But Asher had insisted on doing things properly, on respecting her reputation and giving her the time she needed to say her goodbyes to Alpine. They spent the next 2 days making final preparations for the journey. Asher purchased a sturdy mule to carry their supplies and Meredith's trunks, and he spent hours checking and rechecking his gear to make sure they had everything they would need. Meredith made her final rounds of the congregation, visiting the sick and elderly, saying goodbye to the people who had become part of her life over the past year. Some of the goodbyes were tearful, particularly with Mrs. Patterson, who had become like a mother to her. "You write to me," Mrs. Patterson insisted as they embraced. "Even if you have to send letters down with Asher when he comes for supplies. I want to know that you are well and happy." "I promise," Meredith said. "And thank you for everything. For your support, for your friendship, for believing in me when so many others did not. You made it easy to believe in you, dear," Mrs. Patterson replied. "Now go and be happy. That is all the thanks I need." Finally, on a clear morning in late summer, Meredith and Asher prepared to leave Alpine. They stood outside the church one last time, and Meredith took a long moment to memorize the building that had been so central to her life for the past year. Then she turned to her husband, this man who had appeared in her life so suddenly and changed everything, and she smiled. "I am ready," she said. Asher helped her onto her horse, a gentle mare he had purchased for her, and they set off toward the mountains, with the mule following behind on a lead rope. The journey would take 2 full days, Asher had explained, longer if they ran into any difficulties. But the weather was fair, and the trail was clear, and they made good progress through the rugged landscape. As they rode, Asher pointed out landmarks and features of the terrain, teaching Meredith to read the land the way he did. He showed her how to spot water sources, how to identify edible plants, how to read animal tracks in the dust. Meredith absorbed every lesson eagerly, understanding that this knowledge would be essential to her survival and success in her new home. They talked as they rode, continuing the conversations that had begun in those 2 weeks of courtship. Asher told her about his childhood in Virginia, about the farm where he had grown up before the war. He spoke of his time as a soldier, though only in general terms, and Meredith understood that there were parts of that experience that were still too painful to examine in detail. She told him more about her mother, who had died when Meredith was 15, and about the years she had spent as her father's helper and companion, learning the work of ministry alongside him. They made camp that first night in a sheltered canyon, and Asher set up a small tent for Meredith while he laid out his bedroll nearby. He built a fire and cooked dinner, a simple meal of beans and salt pork. But it tasted better to Meredith than any fancy dish she had eaten in town. There was something about eating under the stars, with the smell of sage and juniper in the air, that made everything seem more vivid and real. After dinner, they sat by the fire, and Asher asked, "Are you having any regrets?" Meredith considered the question seriously before answering. "No," she said finally. "I will miss some of the people in Alpine, and I will think often of my father and the church we built together. But regrets? No. This feels right, Asher. Being here with you, heading toward our future, this is exactly where I am meant to be." He reached out and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I am glad," he said quietly, "because I want you to be happy, Meredith. That is what matters most to me now. Your happiness and your well-being." She squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his grip. "I am happy," she assured him. "Perhaps happier than I have been in a very long time." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down to embers. And when Meredith finally retired to the tent, she fell asleep almost immediately, lulled by the sounds of the wilderness and the knowledge that Asher was keeping watch outside. The second day of travel was more challenging as they began to climb into the higher elevations. The trail grew steeper and rockier, and the air became thinner and cooler. But the views were breathtaking. with the vast expanse of West Texas stretching out below them in shades of brown and gold, broken by the deep green of scattered vegetation. Meredith had never seen anything so beautiful or so vast, and she found herself constantly turning in her saddle to take in new perspectives. As the afternoon wore on, Asher began pointing out familiar landmarks, indicating that they were getting close to his cabin. "Just over this next ridge," he said, and Meredith could hear the pride and affection in his voice. "I built it 3 years ago, right after I first came up here. It took me most of a summer, but it was worth every blister and every backache." They crested the ridge, and there it was, a sturdy log cabin nestled in a small valley, with a stream running nearby and tall pines providing shade. It was larger than Meredith had expected, with a solid roof and a covered porch across the front. Beside the cabin was a small barn for livestock, and beyond that she could see a garden plot, currently overgrown from Asher's absence, but showing signs of having been productive earlier in the season. "It is wonderful," Meredith breathed, and she meant it. There was something about the cabin, something about its solidity and its perfect integration into the landscape, that spoke to careful craftsmanship and genuine care. This was not just a shelter, but a home, and Asher had built it with his own hands. He helped her dismount and then immediately set about tending to the horses and the mule, making sure they were watered and fed before seeing to anything else. Meredith watched him work, noting the efficiency and confidence of his movements, the obvious love he had for this place. When the animals were settled, he turned to her with an almost shy expression. "Would you like to see inside?" She nodded, and he led her up onto the porch and through the front door. The interior of the cabin was dim after the bright sunlight outside, but as her eyes adjusted, Meredith could see that it was surprisingly spacious and well appointed. There was a large main room with a stone fireplace at one end and a sturdy table with benches in the center. Shelves lined the walls, holding books, tools, and various supplies. A ladder led up to a loft area, and there were 2 doors off the main room, one leading to what appeared to be a bedroom and the other to a storeroom. "It is not much," Asher said, watching her face anxiously. "But it is solid and warm, and I can make improvements as we need them." "It is perfect," Meredith said firmly. "Truly, Asher, this is more than I expected. You have built something remarkable here." Relief and pleasure washed across his face. "I'm glad you think so. I want you to feel at home here, Meredith. I want you to be comfortable and happy." Over the next few days, they settled into a routine together. Asher showed Meredith around the property, introducing her to the rhythms of mountain life. He taught her how to fish in the stream, how to identify which plants in the area were useful for food or medicine, how to read the weather by watching the behavior of animals and the movement of clouds. Meredith proved to be an eager and capable student, picking up skills quickly and asking thoughtful questions. In turn, Meredith began to make the cabin truly feel like a home. She unpacked her trunks, adding her books to Asher's collection on the shelves and hanging curtains she had brought from Alpine in the windows. She took over the cooking duties, and though her meals were simple, they were prepared with care and creativity. She also began organizing their living space more efficiently, finding ways to maximize the use of the available room and making small improvements that enhanced both function and comfort. But perhaps most importantly, they grew closer as husband and wife. Those first few nights, Asher had been almost painfully careful with Meredith, treating her as though she might break. But gradually, as she responded to his touches with increasing confidence and passion of her own, he allowed himself to show her the full depth of his desire and his love. Their physical relationship became a beautiful expression of the emotional and spiritual bond they were building. And Meredith found herself constantly amazed by the tenderness this powerful man showed her. As summer turned to fall, they established patterns that would define their life together. Asher spent his days hunting, trapping, and maintaining the property, while Meredith tended the cabin, preserved food for winter, and began reaching out to the scattered population of the mountains. True to Asher's prediction, there were other people living in the high country, trappers and prospectors, and a few families trying to homestead in the harsh environment. Many of them had not seen a minister or received any spiritual guidance in years, and they welcomed Meredith's visits with gratitude and enthusiasm. She began holding informal services on Sunday afternoons, inviting anyone within traveling distance to come to the cabin for hymns, prayer, and a simple meal. Attendance was sporadic, depending on weather and work demands. But Meredith did not mind. She understood that mountain life operated by different rules than town life, and she adapted her ministry accordingly. She also began visiting the sick and elderly who could not travel, riding out with Asher to remote cabins and camps, offering what comfort and assistance she could. One afternoon in October, as the aspens were turning gold and the air carried the first real chill of approaching winter, Meredith and Asher sat together on the porch of their cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of orange and purple. Meredith was working on mending one of Asher's shirts, while he was repairing a leather harness that had broken during a recent trip to check his trap lines. "I have been thinking," Meredith said, breaking the comfortable silence, "about how my life has changed over the past few months, about how different things are now compared to how I thought they would be." Asher looked up from his work, his expression concerned. "Are you unhappy?" "No," Meredith said quickly, reaching out to touch his arm reassuringly. "The opposite, actually. I am happier than I have been in years, maybe happier than I have ever been. But I find myself wondering sometimes if this is all real. If I really married a man I had only just met and moved to the mountains to live in a cabin miles from the nearest town. It feels like something from a storybook, not something that could actually happen in real life." Asher set down the harness and shifted closer to her on the bench. "I know what you mean," he admitted. "Sometimes I look at you sitting there in our home, and I cannot quite believe that you chose this life, that you chose me. But then I remember that day in the church, the way I felt when I first saw you, and I know that whatever force brought us together was stronger than chance or logic. It was meant to be." Meredith leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid strength of him, the steady beat of his heart. "My father used to say that God works in mysterious ways, that sometimes the path we are meant to walk is not the one we would have chosen for ourselves. I used to think that meant we should accept hardship and difficulty as divine will. But now I think maybe it means something different. Maybe it means that sometimes, when we least expect it, we are given a gift that changes everything, and we have to be brave enough to accept it even when it does not make sense." "You were brave," Asher said, turning to look at her. "Braver than I think you realize. You took a leap of faith with a stranger, left everything familiar behind, and built a new life in a place you had never seen. That takes tremendous courage." "So did you," Meredith pointed out. "You opened your heart to another person after years of choosing solitude. You let me into your world, into this place that had been yours alone. That takes courage, too." He kissed the top of her head, a gesture that had become familiar and beloved over the past months. "We are quite the pair, are we not? Two people who found each other at exactly the right moment and had the courage to seize the opportunity." "Yes," Meredith agreed softly. We are. As winter approached, they prepared the cabin and the property for the harsh months ahead. Asher brought in extra firewood, stacking it high under the porch roof where it would stay dry. He checked and reinforced the barn, making sure it would protect the animals from the worst of the winter storms. He also hunted extensively, bringing home deer and elk that they butchered and preserved, ensuring they would have meat throughout the cold season. Meredith threw herself into preservation work, canning vegetables from the garden, drying herbs, making preserves from the wild berries Asher showed her how to find. She also spent time preparing the cabin for long periods of being snowed in, organizing their supplies, making sure they had everything they might need for entertainment and education during the months when travel would be difficult or impossible. The first major snowstorm arrived in early November, dumping nearly 2 feet of snow overnight and transforming the landscape into a white wonderland. Meredith woke to find Asher already up, stoking the fire and preparing breakfast. The cabin was warm and cozy, and through the windows she could see the world outside, blanketed in pristine white. "Good morning," Asher said, smiling at her. "Welcome to your first mountain winter." Meredith joined him at the table, accepting the cup of coffee he poured for her. "It is beautiful," she said, gazing out at the snow. "But I can see why you've stocked up so thoroughly on supplies. I do not think we will be going anywhere for a while." "Probably not for a few days at least," Asher agreed. "But we have everything we need right here. Food, warmth, good company. We will be fine." And they were fine. More than fine. The winter months, which Meredith had worried might feel confining or isolating, instead became a time of deep connection and growing love. They spent their days reading to each other from their combined library, playing games, working on individual projects, and simply talking about everything and anything. They made love often, learning each other's bodies and desires with increasing confidence and joy. And they dreamed together about the future, about the life they would build when spring came again. During a particularly long storm in December, when they were snowbound for nearly a week, Meredith began to suspect that she might be pregnant. She said nothing at first, wanting to be sure before she raised Asher's hopes. But as the signs became more evident, she could no longer keep the news to herself. She chose to tell him on Christmas Eve, after a simple dinner and the exchange of small gifts they had made for each other. Asher had carved her a beautiful jewelry box from a piece of aromatic cedar, while she had sewn him a new shirt from fabric she had brought from Alpine. As they sat by the fire, comfortable in the warm glow of the flames and the oil lamp on the table, Meredith took a deep breath and said, "I have one more gift for you, though it is not something you can hold in your hands." Asher looked at her curiously. "What do you mean?" "I mean that in the summer, probably late July or early August, you are going to become a father." The expression that crossed his face was one Meredith would remember for the rest of her life. Shock, followed rapidly by joy so intense it seemed to radiate from him like heat from the fire. "Truly?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "You are certain?" "As certain as I can be without a doctor's confirmation," Meredith replied, smiling through the tears that had begun to stream down her face. "We are going to have a baby, Asher." He crossed the room in 2 long strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her so carefully, as though she had suddenly become fragile. "A baby," he repeated, wonder in his voice. "Our baby. Meredith, I did not dare hope for this. Not so soon. I thought we would have years together before children came into the picture." "Life moves at its own pace," Meredith said, echoing the philosophy they had both come to embrace. And apparently, our child was eager to join us. That night, as they lay together in their bed, Asher placed his large hand gently on Meredith's still flat belly and spoke to the child growing there. "I promise you," he said quietly, "that I will be the best father I can be. I will protect you and provide for you and love you with everything I have. And I will make sure you know every day how much your mother and I wanted you, how much joy you have already brought into our lives." Meredith covered his hand with hers, feeling the warmth of his palm through her nightgown. "And I promise that we will raise you to be strong and kind, to appreciate the beauty of this place where you will grow up, and to always follow your heart even when it leads you down unexpected paths." The winter continued, and Meredith's pregnancy progressed without complication. Asher became even more protective than before, constantly worrying about her well-being and trying to take over all the heavy work. Meredith found his concern endearing, but also occasionally frustrating, and she had to remind him regularly that she was pregnant, not invalid. As spring arrived and the snow began to melt, Asher made a trip down to Alpine for supplies and to consult with a doctor there about Meredith's pregnancy. He returned with reassurances that everything seemed to be progressing normally, along with advice about what to expect in the coming months. He also brought back letters from Mrs. Patterson and some of the other women Meredith had befriended, all of them thrilled by the news of the baby and sending their love and support. Summer in the mountains was glorious, with wildflowers blooming in every color imaginable, and the days long and warm. Meredith spent hours sitting on the porch, her hands on her growing belly, feeling the baby move and kick. She continued her ministry work as long as she was able. Though as her pregnancy advanced, people increasingly came to the cabin rather than expecting her to travel to them. Asher was constantly amazed by the changes in her body, by the visible evidence of the life they had created together. He would sit with her in the evenings, his hand on her belly, feeling their child's movements and marveling at the miracle of it all. "Have you thought about names?" he asked one evening in mid-July, as the sun set over the mountains and painted the sky in brilliant shades of pink and orange. "I have," Meredith admitted. "If it is a boy, I would like to name him after my father, Samuel Garrett Owens. If it is a girl, I thought perhaps Ada, after your mother." Asher felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Those are perfect names," he managed. "Thank you for honoring our parents that way." "They are part of who we are," Meredith said simply. "It feels right to pass their names on to the next generation." The baby arrived on a hot afternoon in early August, after a labor that lasted nearly 12 hours. Asher had ridden down to fetch Mrs. Henderson, a woman from one of the nearby homesteads who had experience as a midwife, and she stayed with them throughout the process, guiding Meredith through the contractions and offering encouragement. Asher held Meredith's hand through it all, his face pale with concern, but his presence steady and reassuring. When their son finally entered the world, red-faced and squalling, Asher felt his heart expand in a way he had not known was possible. Mrs. Henderson placed the baby in Meredith's arms, and Asher watched his wife cradle their child with a look of such pure love and wonder that it brought tears to his eyes. "Hello, Samuel," Meredith whispered, stroking the baby's downy head. "Welcome to the world, little one." Asher reached out with one finger to touch his son's tiny hand, and Samuel's fingers immediately curled around it, gripping with surprising strength. "He is perfect," Asher breathed. "Absolutely perfect." The weeks following Samuel's birth were a blur of sleepless nights and constant feeding. But neither Meredith nor Asher would have traded that time for anything. They took turns walking the cabin with the baby when he fussed, sang to him, talked to him about everything and nothing. Asher proved to be a natural father, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he changed diapers and bathed his tiny son. As Samuel grew from a newborn into an infant and then a toddler, the cabin filled with the sounds of childhood. Laughter and crying, babbling, and eventually words, the patter of small feet across the wooden floor. Asher built his son a cradle and then a small bed, carved toys for him to play with, taught him to identify animal tracks and bird calls. Meredith sang him songs her mother had taught her, read to him from the books in their library, began his education in letters and numbers. When Samuel was 2 years old, Meredith became pregnant again. And the following spring, she gave birth to a daughter they named Ada, just as they had planned years before. Ada was different from her brother, quieter and more observant, with her father's gray eyes and her mother's auburn hair. The cabin, which had once been a bachelor's rough shelter, was now unmistakably a family home, filled with love and laughter and the organized chaos of young children. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and growth. Asher continued his work as a trapper and hunter, but he also began taking on other responsibilities in the mountain community. He helped neighbors with difficult projects, mediated disputes when they arose, served as a connection between the scattered residents and the towns below. Meredith's ministry expanded as well, with more and more people seeking her counsel and spiritual guidance. She officiated at weddings and baptisms, conducted funeral services, visited the sick and lonely, and always offered a listening ear and a compassionate heart to anyone who needed it. When Samuel was 8 and Ada was 6, they welcomed a third child, a son they named Jacob. And 2 years after that, their family was completed with the birth of another daughter, Lily. The cabin had to be expanded to accommodate their growing family. And Asher spent an entire summer building an addition that included 2 more bedrooms and a larger kitchen. Through all of it, through the challenges and the joys, the hard work and the celebrations, Asher and Meredith's love continued to grow and deepen. They still sat together on the porch in the evenings when time allowed, watching the sunset over the mountains and talking about their day. They still found moments of intimacy and passion despite the demands of parenthood. And they still looked at each other sometimes with that same sense of wonder and gratitude that had defined their relationship from the very beginning. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Asher arranged for the children to spend the night with the Hendersons so that he and Meredith could have an evening alone together. He prepared a special dinner, complete with a bottle of wine he had been saving for a special occasion. And after they ate, they took a walk to the spot where they had first seen the cabin from the ridge all those years ago. "Do you ever regret it?" Asher asked as they stood looking down at their home, where lamplight glowed in the windows and smoke drifted lazily from the chimney. "Saying yes to a crazy mountain man who proposed after knowing you for less than an hour?" Meredith turned to look at him, this man who had changed her life so completely and so wonderfully. His hair was still long, though now streaked with gray at the temples. His face was more weathered, lined by sun and wind and the passage of time, but his eyes still held that same intensity, that same depth of feeling that had captured her heart 10 years ago. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "You gave me a life I never could have imagined, Asher. You gave me freedom and purpose and love beyond measure. You gave me our children and this beautiful home, and a community that values me for who I am, rather than trying to fit me into a predetermined role. How could I ever regret that?" "I gave you those things," Asher said, pulling her close. "But you gave me just as much in return. You gave me a reason to rejoin the world, a reason to let someone pass the walls I had built around my heart. You gave me a family and a purpose beyond mere survival. You took a rough cabin in the wilderness and transformed it into a true home. I am the one who should be asking if you have any regrets." "Then we are even," Meredith said, smiling up at him. "Two people with no regrets and a lifetime of love still ahead of us." They kissed then, standing on that ridge as the stars began to emerge overhead, and it felt exactly like their first kiss in the church all those years ago. A promise, a pledge, a beginning rather than an ending. As the years continued to pass, their children grew into capable, confident young people. Samuel developed his father's love of the wilderness and his skill with tracking and hunting. Ada inherited her mother's gift for words and compassion, often helping with ministry work and showing a particular talent for comforting those in distress. Jacob was the adventurer of the family, always pushing boundaries and exploring new territory, while Lily was the peacemaker, the one who could smooth over conflicts and bring people together. Asher and Meredith took pride in all their children, celebrating their unique gifts and supporting their individual dreams. They taught them to read the land and the sky, to value education and hard work, to treat others with respect regardless of their station in life. They also taught them the story of how their parents had met, about the day a mountain man had walked into a church and helped a young woman sweep, and how that simple act of service had led to a proposal and a marriage that defied convention, but proved to be exactly right. When Samuel turned 18, he announced his intention to become a guide, leading hunting and exploration parties through the mountains. Asher helped him establish his business, drawing on his own decades of experience to teach his son everything he knew about surviving and thriving in the high country. Ada, at 16, declared her desire to become a teacher and minister like her mother, and Meredith began training her in earnest, passing on the lessons and wisdom she had accumulated over the years. As their children began to build their own lives, Asher and Meredith found themselves returning to the quiet rhythms of their early years together. They still worked hard, still served their community, but there was also more time for each other. For long walks through the mountains they both loved, for sitting together and simply being present in each other's company. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching yet another spectacular sunset, Meredith said, "Do you remember what you said to me that day in the church, when you asked me to marry you?" "I remember every word," Asher replied. "I said that I had been hiding rather than living, that meeting you had woken me up to what I was missing. I said I wanted to show you the mountains and build you a home where you could be yourself without judgment or restriction." "You kept every one of those promises," Meredith said softly. "You showed me the mountains, and they are more beautiful than I ever imagined. You built me a home, not just this cabin, but a life, a family, a purpose. And you have never once tried to limit me or make me fit into someone else's idea of who I should be. You have been everything you promised, and so much more." Asher took her hand, that gesture that had become so familiar over the past 25 years of their marriage. "You made it easy," he said. "Loving you, building a life with you, has been the greatest privilege of my existence. If I have kept my promises, it is only because you inspired me to be worthy of you." "We have been good for each other," Meredith said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Two people who took a chance on love when logic said we should not, and built something lasting and true." They sat together as the sun sank below the horizon and the first stars appeared, content in the life they had created and the love they shared. Behind them, through the cabin windows, they could hear their children talking and laughing, the sounds of family and home. Ahead of them stretched more years together, more sunsets to watch, more challenges to face, more joys to celebrate. Years later, when both Asher and Meredith had gray in their hair and their children had children of their own, they still told the story of how they met. They told it to their grandchildren, who would sit wide-eyed and amazed that their grandfather had proposed to their grandmother after knowing her for less than an hour. They told it to young couples in the mountain community who came to them for advice about love and marriage. And they told it to each other, sometimes, late at night when they could not sleep, recounting the details and marveling again at the courage and faith it had taken to trust in something so improbable. The cabin they had built together, the one that had started as a simple bachelor's shelter and grown into a home that had housed 4 children and countless guests, stood as a testament to what was possible when 2 people chose love over fear, possibility over limitation. The church in Alpine, which Meredith had swept alone that fateful afternoon, had long since been replaced by a larger building with a full-time minister. But the legacy of Meredith's work there lived on in the mountain community she had served for decades. As Asher approached his 70th birthday and Meredith her 62nd, they began to think about their legacy, about what they would leave behind when their time on earth ended. They did not have great wealth to pass on, no grand estates or important positions. But they had something far more valuable. A family built on love and respect. A community strengthened by their service and care. And a story that demonstrated the transformative power of following your heart even when it led you down unexpected paths. On a warm summer evening, much like the one when Asher had first walked into that church in Alpine, they gathered their entire family together for a celebration. All 4 of their children were there with their spouses and children, filling the expanded cabin and spilling out onto the porch and the surrounding yard. There was food and music and laughter, the sounds of a life well lived and love well shared. As the evening drew to a close and the grandchildren were being tucked into various beds and bedrolls, Asher and Meredith found themselves once again on the porch, looking out at the mountains that had been their home for more than 40 years. Samuel joined them, now a man in his 40s with his own teenage children, and he put his arms around both his parents. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything you have given us, for the life you built here, for showing us what it means to love someone completely and to live according to your own truth rather than others' expectations." "You are most welcome," Meredith replied, her voice thick with emotion. "But you should know that the life we built here, the love we have shared, has been its own reward. We did not do any of it for recognition or gratitude, though we appreciate both. We did it because we could not imagine doing anything else." After Samuel returned inside, Asher and Meredith remained on the porch, holding hands and watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. The air was sweet with the scent of pine and wildflowers, and from the cabin behind them came the muted sounds of their family settling in for the night. 42 years, Asher said, his voice quiet but full of wonder. 42 years since I walked into that church and found you sweeping. 42 years since I asked you to marry me in the craziest proposal in the history of proposals. And every single day has been a gift. Every single day, Meredith agreed. Even the hard ones, even the days when we struggled or fought or faced challenges that seemed insurmountable. Because we faced them together, and that made all the difference. They sat in comfortable silence for a while longer, each lost in their own memories of the life they had shared. Then Meredith said, "If you could go back to that day in the church, knowing everything you know now, would you do anything differently?" Asher considered the question carefully before answering. "No," he said finally. "Not a single thing. Every choice we made, every path we took, led us to this moment, led us to this family, this life, this love. Why would I want to change any of that?" That is exactly how I feel, Meredith said, smiling in the darkness. We took a leap of faith together, and we landed somewhere better than either of us could have dreamed. That is all anyone can hope for in this life. As the years continued to pass, Asher and Meredith remained active in their community and involved in the lives of their children and grandchildren. They slowed down somewhat, as age naturally demanded, but their minds remained sharp and their commitment to each other never wavered. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary surrounded by 3 generations of family, with people traveling from across the territory to honor the couple who had become legends in the mountain community. When Asher was 78 and Meredith was 70, they took one final trip together to Alpine. The town had changed dramatically from the small settlement they had known decades earlier, with new buildings and businesses, railroad access, and a population that had quadrupled. But the church, or rather its replacement, still stood on the same spot, and they made their way there on a quiet afternoon, moving slowly but steadily. The current minister, a young man who had heard stories of the legendary Meredith Garrett Owens, welcomed them warmly and offered to let them spend some time in the sanctuary alone. They accepted gratefully, and once the door closed behind him, they stood together in the center of the church, remembering. It was about here, Asher said, gesturing to the floor beneath their feet. Where I first started sweeping, where I worked my way toward you and then asked you the question that changed both of our lives. I remember, Meredith said, her eyes bright with tears and laughter. I remember thinking you were insane, that I was insane for even considering your proposal. But I also remember feeling deep in my bones that it was right, that you were right. We were both right, Asher said, pulling her close. We saw something in each other that day, something true and essential, and we had the courage to act on it. That took faith, Meredith. Faith in ourselves, in each other, and in something larger than both of us. They held each other there in the church where their story had begun. 2 people who had lived a lifetime together and loved each other through every moment of it. When they finally left, walking slowly back through the town toward where their son Samuel waited with a wagon to take them home, they felt at peace. Their circle was complete, their story told, their legacy secured. Asher lived to be 82 years old, passing away peacefully in his sleep with Meredith beside him, as she had been for nearly 55 years. His funeral was attended by more than 200 people, mountain folk and townspeople alike, all of them with stories of how Asher had helped them, guided them, or simply shown them kindness when they needed it most. He was buried in a small cemetery near the cabin, under a towering pine with a view of the mountains he had loved so much. Meredith lived 3 more years, spending her days with her children and grandchildren, continuing to serve her community in whatever ways she was able. She wrote down the story of how she and Asher had met, wanting to preserve every detail for future generations. She conducted services on Sundays when she felt strong enough, her voice still clear and compelling even in her 80s. And every evening, she sat on the porch of the cabin and talked to Asher, telling him about her day and the family they had built together, feeling his presence in the mountains they had called home. When Meredith died at the age of 83, she was laid to rest beside Asher, and the tombstone placed there bore a simple inscription: 2 hearts, 1 love, a lifetime of faith. The cabin they had built and expanded over the years became a gathering place for the family, maintained by their children and grandchildren as a tribute to the love story that had started there. And sometimes, on quiet summer evenings, when the light slanted gold across the mountains and the air was sweet with the scent of pine and wildflowers, visitors to that cabin swore they could feel something special in the air, some echo of the profound love and commitment that had defined Asher and Meredith's life together. Because true love, the kind that is built on respect and courage, and the willingness to take impossible leaps of faith, never truly dies. It lives on in the children who carry on their parents' legacy, in the community strengthened by their service, and in the stories told generation after generation about a mountain man who walked into a church, helped a woman sweep, and asked her to marry him there, starting a love story that would span more than half a century and touch countless lives. Their great-grandchildren, when they were old enough to understand, would ask to hear the story again and again, never tiring of the tale of how their great-grandparents had met and fallen in love in less than an hour, how they had built a life together in the mountains against all odds and conventional wisdom. And in telling that story, the family kept alive the most important lesson Asher and Meredith had taught: that love, real love, is not about following rules or meeting expectations. It is about recognizing truth when you see it, having the courage to act on that recognition, and then doing the hard, rewarding work of building a life together one day at a time. The mountains where they had made their home still stood, eternal and beautiful, a fitting monument to a love that had been equally enduring. And in those mountains, in the cabin where 4 children had been raised and countless lives had been touched, the story of Asher and Meredith Owens lived on, a testament to the transformative power of love and faith, and the courage to follow your heart even when it leads you down the most unexpected of paths.